place, and we're running a series of webinars looking at things that happen in the events marketplace and just in the industry in general. Now today's webinar, I think, is pretty current, really, as it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and as the UK and many parts of Europe and Asia are moving out of lockdown, we thought we'd do a webinar based around how you can prepare your teams for exiting lockdown. So we're looking at really about 30-40 minute duration, and it's good for people really even managing a team or a large department. And in terms of the agenda today, we want to have a look at how lockdown has not only affected the health of individuals, but how it's affecting and changed the workplace. Then we're going to look at how people are concerned about the various levels of transition out of lockdown, how you can support your team return to the workplace, and then look at really the new rules and things that are going to affect you in the workplace. Now, my guest speaker today is John Devitt, who is the CEO of Recovery for Life, who are experts in mental health and particularly also in testing. Yeah. How you doing, John?
Yeah, we're good. Thanks, Simon, and thank you for inviting us on. So, looking forward to it.
Well, would you give a little snapshot on Recovery for Life?
Yeah, sure. So we're a specialist drug, alcohol, and mental health service primarily, and we sort of work primarily with corporate clients, multi-sector. Primarily, we're across the northeast, but we do have a few clients down in London and other parts of the country. And we sort of really specialize in sort of testing, training, and treatment for how you actually manage some of these issues in the workplace. And really, it's from the testing side and really the link with mental health that we've been quite prominent, particularly in the Northeast, around delivering testing for businesses for COVID to help teams get back to work.
Okay, perfect. That's perfect for us. So, I mean, I think really in terms of today, I kind of see this kind of first slide as being really about almost like a loop, a kind of a lockdown Groundhog Day. I think it. By being in lockdown, I think people are being less physical, which can lead to kind of less sleep. Less sleep can lead to anxiety. Anxiety can lead to using more substances. And I know you're a bit specialist, aren't you, John, in this field?
Yeah, we are, and I suppose the issue here is, and where there's direct relevance, is for many years we've worked in the field of addiction, running treatment services for the NHS in places like Sunderland, Stockton, down in Hackney, in rehabs and various other places. And I suppose the starting point when you're dealing with drugs and alcohol, you will always see mental health problems. They're always a comorbidity. But you will also, what you're really dealing with is trauma and isolation. And actually, if you think about it, that's exactly why this sort of fits in at this time. Because when you're working in these fields, what you're really trying to do is sort of organize chaos. Now, if you look at what's happening with the pandemic, there's never been anything quite like this, certainly not in living memory, and certainly not in a communication age as advanced as ours, where there's so many different sort of mixed messages, etc., coming through. The impact on this is, first of all, we're isolated. And the real thing, I mean, first of all, the language possibly has been wrong. And I know WHO, for example, have pushed strongly to try and rephrase this concept of social isolation, really to change it into physical isolation, because really what we're looking for is a greater social connection. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
And so if you have that as your starting point, well, you've got to look at what people do to cope when they're under pressure, when they're under stress. And if you think about it, the traditional approaches, if you go back to what the body and the brain's designed for, it's designed, the amygdala is your fear, it's your sort of fight, flight, freeze and flop actions. That's what your brain, how it responds to sort of threat. And none of those actions actually work in this circumstance. and in these circumstances. So, you know, there's nothing we can specifically fight, though the language of fighting, sort of fighting back and controlling the virus and all that sort of stuff, can be quite helpful because it gives a sense of purpose. But fundamentally, it's completely out of our control. If you then look at sort of flee, there is nowhere to run. This is a global pandemic. And there were some very interesting things right at the beginning of the pre-lockdown, where there were lots of, you know, quite a lot of very wealthy people looking at locking themselves away on private islands and bunkers and things like that.
Yeah.
And you're sort of stepping into sort of Edgar Allan Poe, Mask of the Red Death territory, basically. But the reality is there's nowhere to flee because this is something that affects everywhere and everyone. If you then look at this concept of sort of freezing and sort of doing the rabbit in the headlights bit and sort of just freeze and we might not be seen, that clearly isn't going to work. And then you're straight into the sort of the flop where you know it doesn't matter if you flop and pass out, you're going to wake up and it's still here.
Yeah.
If you're sort of living in that world, what's interesting is we can't react as we normally would. So what you're actually doing is people are relying and switching into, and we're all doing it, into patterns of behavior which would aren't necessary. They make you feel good at the time, but they don't necessarily help you long term. And these are the issues that we're going to see in the workplace in the reintroduction. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, yeah. I mean, in terms of anxiety, obviously, there's things like anxiety about the actual pandemic, but the long-term effects, you know, friends and family, you know, jobs, all those kind of things are affecting individuals right now, aren't they?
Yeah, we are. And really what the biggest problem we've got is fear. Because, and rightly so in many ways, but it's actually about understanding. The worst thing about fear is not knowing. And I think the onus, if you know, we can't be, you know, it's not about being political on this. This is where, I would suggest it starts at a global level and then comes down to national level and then straight into the workplace, particularly for business leaders, is that actually clear and communications are the key thing at this stage. So if you look at a lot of the misinformation that's been flying around, if you look, it's an area that social media doesn't really help with. Social media is, you know, pre-COVID can be it's a very effective tool, but it can be very damaging to one's mental health as well, because it sets up usually an unverified sort of statements and comments and sort of facts with no basis to them, so to speak. Yeah. Actually, it sort of accentuates the problems and the feelings that people are having. Does that make sense? And when you look then at how people sort of cope with that, what people will do is you retreat to almost a sense that it's like an extended Christmas holiday, where people eat too much, drink too much. They stay up later, they lose a sense of the timings and routine that they normally have. And the key byproduct of that is deteriorating mental health. Yeah. And that's really what will be the big marker going forward, because we've got to remember that the state of mental health, although it had been much higher on the agenda before the pandemic, it actually was pretty poor in the workplace. So this is only going to accentuate a situation that was already not in a great state. Yeah, yeah. Now, in terms of the actual workplace, obviously the lockdown has had some quite significant challenges and changes. So I know on our last webinar we looked at difficulties in managing remotely, but also you've got remote teams, you've got people going through furlough, job losses, and also working with children. I've got a young child here, and it's really affecting how I work and also my friends are working, really, and having that kind of work-life balance where what time do you turn off, and maybe in some companies people are having to do more work because there are furloughs and staff missing. Well, I think this is a really important point, because actually what you're looking at is the impact of isolation. And actually, and even within your family, isolation from work I'm talking about, it's very interesting. We've fallen into the trap ourselves, because I work with my son, who's a co-director of the company, and we probably realized, you know, first of all, I don't think we really are very good at taking time off. So we're completely hypocritical about, as many people are, about the number of hours. But actually, the volume of work has actually gone up for many people, either because they're picking up the slack from people who've had to go on furlough and to maintain the business, and there's a lot of fear generated around the continuity and what's going to happen for business going forward. But also, it's actually on a personal level, it's hard to switch off, because there's two areas. First of all, working from home and isolating, if you're not used to this, it can put a lot of strain on relationships. A lot of people aren't used to spending that much time with their children outside a holiday environment. And they're not just children. If you also look at the issues around where people have elder parents who they have responsibility for, or who they're worried about, or who are in care homes in particular, these actually are all issues that just accentuate those sort of stress levels and fear levels as they sort of rise. But there are some positives as well. It's an interesting one, because actually the number of times we'll be on Zoom meetings with, you know, fairly formal, traditionally would be fairly formal meetings, and you know, you're chatting away 1 minute and then some big daft Labrador jumps onto the table or something, and you know, it's showing a slightly more human side and highlighting the fact that everybody is struggling with this. And that's the other point, is, which I would hope that coming into the workplace, people remember those feeling that actually everybody suffered through this this current situation.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, you know, I think we've kind of looked at the last kind of few weeks, like months, and I think maybe now we can move on to really the kind of transition now into the next phase. And I think there are certain key things that people are concerned about. And I think you've already touched on the kind of the family support, both for either children or, you know, older parents. You know, there's things like you know, how to get to and from work now, and also the long-term impact of the lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you look at it, and again, it's not a political statement, but I think the point I was made earlier on about the real importance of clear communication, that where it doesn't come out is where it sort of exacerbates problems. So if you look at the select committee that's come out today, which has been very critical of the communications and phasing and the management of this, it's very interesting that for the first time certainly I can't think of another situation where the home countries, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, have decided we are not following this guidance. And actually, there's a direct split and a direct conflict between the advice being given at national level, and you know, also, let alone international level. And I think what that highlights, when you look in terms of government phasing, it's not just about government phasing. The last messages have been very clear that it's up to you to manage this sort of situation. And I think this is where the really important thing for companies and business owners and business leaders is they've really got to understand what the impacts of that are on their staff. So the absolute fear, particularly if you're dealing with staff who don't have a choice about coming back to work, either because they fear they'll lose their job, or that they don't receive sick pay, or that they're in a situation where they're not really, or that they're needed. You know, they're an essential worker, for example. So the picture that came out on the first week from the metro, you know, from the underground and from the bus system, will have actually made the problem worse in many ways, because I think the key thing for a business to make sense of what's going on is really to plan and engage with their teams on the way forward that's going to suit them and their people. Does that make sense?
No, totally. I
And
mean, you know,
it's
I've
quite
not been on the team now for I think 8 weeks. I think it is. So yeah, it's it'll be a big change for me. I've just got a couple of questions, John. So let's have a look.
yeah,
We've got one saying, good point on the routine. Would like to hear more on how we can get our employees to adjust their routines back to the way things were. I think that make our link in read onto our next slide, really. So again, you know, this is about really how you can support your teams. I think your point here about clear communication is really important. And actually, yeah, I think going back to the kind of government phasing about how employees interpret that information and communicate to their employees, it is really important.
absolutely. And what we're actually advising, we're helping a number of the companies we work with to actually devise, first of all, to look at your policies. Always start with your policies. And people do need to look at having a separate sort of viral control or viral response policy from which people can have a discussion. And as with, we would always advise things like drug and alcohol policies, mental health policies, health and well-being policies, medication inquiry policies, things like this. That actually, the more consultative you are, the more effective that policy is going to be if you bring people with you. Now, and this is the real issue, it's about bringing people with you. So if you look at specifically in terms of what you can do about it, in terms of flexibility, what this has shown, the lockdown, a positive has shown, is that many jobs and many sort of work patterns can change, and work patterns can be more flexible now. I think the other issue, and it sort of highlights the areas where business can't function without direct contact. So we've got two really clear indicators here. I think the other thing that is an opportunity, and some of the discussions I've been having with business leaders have been around previously, pre to the lockdown. We might have been, for example, helping them develop a health and well-being strategies or a mental health support program and strategy to say, implement or sort of support initiatives like the mental health first aid initiatives that many companies have gone down that route, or their own mental health programs. Now, what's really interesting on that, it was in many of those conversations, people said, well, we want to change the culture of the organization. We want it to be more accepting. We want it to be able to be understand the issues that society and individuals are going through. And we want to be able to actually respond, because these are the team we want to work with. We want to keep good people and we want to attract new talent. And this is how we see we'll do it. So it's very interesting that actually, if you look with this sort of block that has come down, it really is the perfect time to look at your company culture and think, hang on, what is it that we want to change, and how could we start that process now before people fully engage coming back? And that very first point on this is on the slide is the clear communication. It's the this is the time to reevaluate who and what you are, and this really comes into where your ethics and where you want to be as a business going forward.
Yeah, I think business going forward now are going to have to be a lot more understanding and flexible in terms of, there'll be people with children at home, how people getting to and from work. I spoke to a friend of mine who works for a multinational company, and they're talking about having, when things move back to normal, maybe having a weekly meeting in the office where they go in, they stand up, there's no handshaking, no interaction, and they go home again. It's about having an understanding and a flexible corporate culture, really.
It does, and I think then it comes back to that where leadership comes in, all right? Because leadership is key here, and it's very interesting. Because as we touched on earlier, and this is really where the link with we've seen through testing, strangely enough, because actually it's also a way that we've noticed employers who are using the testing approach that we've developed with them. Actually, they've seen that it's sort of redrawn and redefined the psychological contract between employer and employee, and particularly around this sense of psychological security and safety for re-entering the workplace. And there's a lot of fear, because what if you know, your children are going to school, what if they bring something back? What if you bring something back from work or from traveling on public transport? You know, there's a whole raft of different sort of concerns coming out, which employers are going to have to deal with to actually reassure people that actually, if you're coming into work, it's going to be safe both physically, but also in a psychological way, that actually we've been through and recognizing levels of trauma. And I don't think we can underestimate this. The studies that have come out from post-SARS 2016 in China, for example, and even if we factor in cultural issues that might be associated with different sort of cultures and approaches to mental health, but the studies, depending on which one you looked at, there were two in particular, which showed that there was anywhere between 28 and 40% of people returning to work were demonstrating signs of PTSD. Now, the main mental health conditions that we're already seeing here are a whole range of different anxiety conditions. We're seeing a whole range of depression. We're seeing trauma linked to grief and loss, where family members have died through the virus, or through where relationships have broken up. We're seeing a whole range of different factors which have to be built into here, and these policies.
Yep. I mean, in terms of, we spoke recently about, the kind of mental health support, and you see the things like team building and virtual socials being quite important, but you think there should be more emphasis now really on the kind of mental health support for long-term issues?
I think, yeah, and I think there's 2-3 issues that we need to come through. We've got to be realistic. Before the lockdown, the mental health services in the UK were in a terrible state. I mean, they've been, and again, it's not being political, the average waiting list to get to see a psychologist. I mean, the first process would be, if you had a mental health issue, usually you might, if your company doesn't have an existing EAP program, and I'll come back to that in a minute, then actually what the usual route would be, see your GP, get referred into talking therapies. Average waiting list for that will be anywhere between sort of, if you were really lucky, 6 weeks up to 18 weeks to get into for some telephone support, generally speaking. If you need something more, and that's where we're talking trauma coming through. And actually, the waiting list to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist, depending on what support you need, is anywhere between 2 and 3 years on average. If you haven't if you're not an immediate risk to yourself or the public.
Yeah.
So which vast majority fits into that category. Now, what this means, and I saw a very interesting webinar with a group based in the city, a mental health group supporting corporates in the city, and they made a very interesting point, which was public sector services are going to be even more stretched. They're absolutely flat out. Great organisations like Mind and people like, a whole range of different local services coming through. But they are absolutely stretched to bursting point. And the suggestion that if you have an EAP program already in place, if you have started to develop mental health services, this is the time to really test them out and to develop them. And in doing so, not only are you going to help your team and speed up the response they get, but you've got an opportunity to help the wider community by taking pressure off public services. And I think this is it's a useful way of thinking about it, because with EAP programs, we found and we offer them, but they tend to be very specialist type work that we do particularly around addiction, mental health, suicidal ideation, all these different things. And actually, if you take, just like the Royal College of Psychiatrists have forecast that they've already seen a 43% increase in crisis management situation, at the same time that their normal run-of-the-mill sort of day-to-day appointments and sort of maintenance have dropped off by 45%. And what that really means is people are in crisis now, but all these other issues, the sort of ongoing management and condition management, is building up and will hit down the line. So the pressure, there's a bit of a pressure keg building. This is the time to talk to your EAP lines if you have one, and check that they actually are qualified and they are able to support trauma.
Okay.
Because that's what we're moving away. We're moving away from fruit on a Friday for your health and well-being strategy into understanding actually where grief, trauma, and isolation are going to make, you know, significant impacts.
Yeah, yeah. So it's about really having a proper program of support to ensure that, you know, what you communicate to your staff it's clear.
Yeah.
You listen to their concerns. I think, yeah, it's great to have a range of, virtual lockdown kind of social kind of interactions to get everyone engaged and happy. Yeah, you mentioned, you know, great incentives and keep morale going, but also to have that kind of longer term mental health support. Yeah. I've actually got a question here from John Cully. I think it kind of moves on as we kind of move into the next question. Really, is we are concerned. What happens if we make the wrong decision in relation to getting our employees back in, and we see infections again? I suppose it kind of links into the kind of next slide, which is about the new realities really of working moving forward.
Yeah, I'll be really honest, John. In response to your question, I think you need to, if you're not comfortable with it, then you really need to take advice and try and follow, you know, do what you really think is best. Now, there's nothing wrong. I think this is this is a really good point for leaders to recognize and to be honest with the teams that we don't have all the answers. And that an interesting. So there's a number of different ways of looking at your question. The very first is, what would happen if you get a team in? There is, and the real risk is that 40% of people who catch the virus are actually asymptomatic. So they're not going to be ill, but they are spreaders. They can, and they won't even know they necessarily have it. So the only way you'll be able to deal with that is actually through testing. To try and rule that out. And really, you do need a multi-systemic approach on this. Now, the health and safety executive, traditionally, I mean, they've changed their policy slightly because they were talking about RIDDOR being used to report such and such, incidences. And HSE do have your guidelines don't go out the window because of the pandemic. Employers have a responsibility for the safety and well-being of their staff. But I think in these circumstances, so long as you can demonstrate that you've done your best and on the best information and evidence available and the best advice, that you've tried to protect people, that is one side. The other side is actually, it's really hard because the projected real issue here, and whether you're talking on a global level or on a company level, there is still a role for testing, tracing, and isolation. And it has to be an ongoing process. And this is what we've been doing with our clients, an ongoing process where, you have to, this isn't a one-hit wonder and everybody's going back. The only one thing that you can be sure of is the world is not going to be the same. And working patterns are going to change, and it will continue to change as it goes through. So I think the key thing here is try and get some advice. It depends very much. Geography is really important because the demographics in the Northeast are very different to London, for example.
Yeah.
And actually, they've got different drivers. Your industry will create major differences. If you're in manufacturing, you can take almost a very sort of structured manufacturing approach, as they would like a production line, to try and bring in things like social distancing. And things like PPE, for example, are well established protections already in those industries. If you're in, say, a non sort of manual, or if you're in an office-based environment, I think this is probably going to be harder. And because people aren't used to those sort of controls. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I think I've seen pictures so far of our office in Canary Wharf. So I've not been there yet, but we have, I think there are 16 lifts in the office, but only going to certain floors. But now it's 4 people per lift. Whereas normally there'd probably be about 10 to 12 people per lift. So that's going to cause, queues to get into lifts, which means more people kind of gathering in kind of corridors, and how you police that. And I think we're going to have one-way streets. I reckon where you can only go in one direction, and that'd be a big shift for us. I mean, I think we're pretty lucky. We can be pretty flexible and do homework in. I think we're going to getting used to video conferencing, aren't we? I mean, it's, as you mentioned earlier, it's becoming it's an everyday thing now. So another couple of questions. So this is cost us. Where would we start to find out where we could access such mental health services, especially outside the big cities?
Right. Well, there's three ways of doing it. And following this, I'm very happy if people want to I'll share my contact details afterwards. If people need any advice on this, please feel free to get in touch. But there's two, it depends on the type of business you're operating and the sort of, quite often, the type of demographic you're employing and your teams. So if you are dealing with a shall we say, more of a manual labor, a manual approach to the workplace, a more blue collar approach, and the company can't afford its own services, then I would suggest that you do need to look where people live and try and tap into local public services if you can. However, just bear in mind what we talked about, waiting lists and pressures on those services. Otherwise, there's a number of different ways privately which we can advise you. We offer them, but there's some good ones and there's some less good ones. It really depends on what issues you're dealing with. Yeah.
Okay. I've got a question from Susanna. What tools do we need to start putting together a plan for after lockdown? How do we decide what is the best way to reduce staff interaction or plan for flexi hours?
Okay, so there's some interesting guides on the HSE website. So I would always suggest that the very first thing is you need a policy and you need a plan. Now, to help inform those policies, first of all, you need to make sure you're compliant with guidelines, with working time directives and regulations and all that sort of stuff. But actually, if you go onto the HSE website and to the government.org website, they've published a number of guides for different industries. I think there's about 9, possibly more up now, each one with a slightly different focus and with suggestions of how you can bring these in. So try and find the closest one to you. Again, if you're getting stuck or if you need some advice, please feel free to drop us a line afterwards, because we work very closely with health and safety specialists as well. But I'll throw in a little tip, which is whatever, as a little tool for engagement. Yeah. And this is a brilliant idea. One of the clients that we work with, they're bringing their staff back, they think, probably mid to end of June. They're not rushing back because they want to see, there's a few more things that need to emerge. But one of the things they've already done is marked up walkways and signage and stuff for one-way traffic around there. It's a mixed office and manufacturing site. But what they've done is, I thought was brilliant, they've actually done a walkthrough video of what the new workplace looks like, and actually talk through and on film showing how to put PPE on, if it's particularly in the manufacturing part, the distance, what it feels like. They've done some really good work around this. And again, it comes straight back to that communication bit. So, but the starting point, start with the legislation, look what you potentially could be unstuck with, and then you build from there, basically. But very happy to advise you afterwards if that helps.
I'll put a link to your website in the chat forum as well, John.
Okay. No problem. Okay.
Wonderful. And then, I mean, that's it for us. If anyone's got any questions, I'll give it them a minute or so to put them in. But otherwise, John, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. I think actually our next webinar may actually be on developing virtual experiences, which is something that we're getting really keen on doing, and we're seeing a shift towards more virtual team building, etc. So I think we may create a webinar just based on that. But thank you very much, John. And then,
and please feel free to get in touch if we can help with anything from particularly around mental health, but testing or advice on whether it's suitable or not for you. Just keep the conversation going.
Perfect. Thank you so much, John. I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Bye.